unspeakable horror in Nashville, Tennessee after a transgender-identified shooter killed 3 children and 3 adults at a private Christian school. And while the nightmarish reality of what happened is difficult to process, the reaction by many to the outrage was bizarre beyond belief. Prime amongst them, the President of the United States, who preceded his words about the tragedy by going on a weird rambling tangent about chocolate chip ice cream.
My name is Joe Biden. I'm Dr. Joe Biden's husband. And I ate Jenny's ice cream, chocolate chip. I came down because I heard there was chocolate chip ice cream. By the way, I have a whole refrigerator full upstairs. You think I'm kidding? I'm not.
The real outrage, though, according to some, was that the psychotic, depraved child killer's pronouns had been disrespected.
5 times CNN misgendered. No correction. A mass shooting is horrible. Misgendering does not make anything better.
I mean, I know Karens are notorious for complaining about trivial things, but complaining about a mass shooter's feelings being hurt, truly beyond the pale. She wasn't finished.
Update. It seems like maybe there's plenty of confusion about whether or not the shooter is a transgender man or woman, and finding out that the police there don't know how to use the right words does not shock me. But mixing genders in the same story is still a problem.
Yeah, so grieving parents have just lost their infant children. But your overriding concern is that police remain politically correct in respecting the memory of the killer. Many responded with this Norm Macdonald bit about ISIS detonating a nuclear device that kills 50 million Americans, and then people on Twitter worrying about Islamophobia. And just like clockwork,
who police say identifies as transgender, that news has already prompted some attacks against the trans community.
I am concerned about how opposition and people who are anti-trans will try to spin this.
Concern about tweets like this from GOP Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene.
But not to be outdone, this galaxy brain chimed in.
Another day, another mass shooting. The shooter has been identified by his dead name. It appears he used he/him pronouns and was a former student of the school. Of course, MSM and the LEOs discussing the issue and misgendering the murderer. I'm sad and angry on so many levels.
You're sad and angry on so many levels. And one of those levels is being mad at the crazed murderer being dead named. No mention of the dead kids. Someone violated your demented language police rules, and that's why you're sad and angry. And it wasn't just alphabet individuals responding like this. The Transgender Resistance Network released an entire statement arguing that there were 2 tragedies yesterday, one being the shooting, the other being the shooter's life being made difficult by anti-trans legislation and right-wing personalities. Oh, will someone think of the poor mass murderer who just shot up the elementary school? What on earth is wrong with you? This whole thing reads like a justification of an Islamic terror attack. Hate has consequences. The consequences being 3 murdered children. The whole statement attempts to justify the consequences. Then lo and behold, we remind the news media to respect the self-identified pronouns of transgender individuals, including the killer who identified as he, him. I identify as trans. If you don't accept that, then you're a bigot, sure. The shooter identified as trans. Gender doesn't matter. Yeah, don't expect the gun control debate to advance much further either. For their part, the media scrambled to cover the story while not knowing which pitfall to avoid. Described the shooter as a man, satiating the trans activists but acknowledging that the culprit was a transgender, or try to bury the transgender aspect of the story entirely by referring to the killer as her biological gender but then upsetting the trans activists. The result was a garbled mess. BBC News confusion about gender identity of shooter. The New York Times appeared to apologise on behalf of Nashville authorities for referring to the killer, a biological woman, as she, her, which was seemingly an effort to distract from the fact that the NYT itself had initially described the shooter as a woman. USA Today also scolded officials for initially misidentifying the gender of the shooter, while Newsweek chose to avoid the quagmire altogether by simply blaming guns, bans on drag queen shows and gender-affirming care. Note how in that instance they're both teasing the killer's motive. A violent backlash against a bill passed in Tennessee earlier this month which bans puberty blockers and hormone treatments being given to children, a completely reasonable measure, as well as restrictions on adult-oriented drag shows taking place on public property. But then in the same sentence, almost attempting to justify that motive. Truly sick stuff. ABC News anchor Terry Moran was also accused of doing something similar.
Audrey Hale was identified herself as a transgender person. State of Tennessee earlier this month passed and the governor signed a bill that banned transgender medical care for minors as well as a law that prohibited adult entertainment, including male and female impersonators, after a series of drag show controversies in that state.
A Washington Post contributor even thanked some ghoul who said they understood the outrage of the shooter for targeting a religious indoctrination center. Another journalist appeared to suggest the Daily Wire bore some responsibility. It was an absolute shit show across the board. And no, I'm not going to resort to crass political point scoring, like the left does whenever an individual from a group that they hate, white people, Christians, men in general, does something outrageous. You've got to ask serious questions when a group that represents such a tiny fraction of the population seems to be more and more susceptible to radicalization than ever before. We saw the appalling treatment that trans activists dished out to Posey Parker in New Zealand, a British woman who, for the crime of saying a woman is an adult female, was harassed, mobbed and assaulted, in a frenzied attack during which Parker said she feared for her life. That mob had behaved similarly under the guise of advancing a right-wing political agenda. You really don't need me to tell you what the media narrative would have been. If you'd like to donate to the families of the victims of this horrendous event, I'll leave a link below.